So you've done some research online, you've picked out your niche topic, you've recorded a few podcast episodes, you've uploaded them to streaming services, and now it's time to watch the listenership roll in, right? Not quite. Hello and welcome to another episode of Digital Marketing Made Simple. I'm your host, Jennie Lyon, and today I wanted to break down the ins and outs of marketing your podcast so that you can maximize your reach and grow your listenership online. Let's jump in. First things first, you really have to let people know about your podcast. And I know it's tough to hear, but there's still work to be done after you record and upload your podcast episode. You have to market it. Thousands and thousands of new podcast episodes are released every single week. And undoubtedly, several popular ones really do share your potential audience. So you need to let new and existing listeners know that your podcast exists. Yes, even your existing listeners. Other podcasts are constantly marketing themselves. And if yours falls off the radar, well, then your current listenership will fall off the radar too. And they'll definitely get scooped up by someone else. So you really need to communicate consistently and loudly that you're here and you're worth checking out and that there's a new episode ready for your audience to download. So where are your podcast audience hubs? Where do your listeners connect with you? You want to make sure that you're engaging with your audience in those spaces and really encouraging discussion so that there's an active community for new listeners to join when they discover you. Next up is word of mouth. Oh my gosh, word of mouth still to this day is golden. So marketing your podcast is essential for your growth, but there will never be a stronger advocate for your podcast than a happy listener. And people are more likely to try something new if a friend or a colleague recommends it, because they can share what they enjoy most about your podcast personally and honestly. And they also know how to communicate their ideas effectively. So their friend or colleague will understand in a way that maybe they never could before. So you want to make sure to encourage that. And whether you're holding listening party contests or you're cultivating online discussions, really inviting people to contribute, you really can help your fans share what they love most about your podcast with the people that they think would genuinely enjoy it as well. Next up is use Google. Oh my gosh, you can really master Google Ads to grow your podcast audience. And Google Ads are an incredible, surgical, customizable tool that you can use to target precisely the crowd who would be interested in listening to your latest podcast. And the nice thing is you only pay when a user clicks your ad. So the more specific that you can be, the more follow through that's going to happen with that target audience. And it's more likely that someone who clicks on your ad will follow through and check out that latest episode. And really, you can even customize what search words that you are going to come up for and that are going to be associated with your ad in the case that there are common words that would trick uninterested listeners into finding your podcast. So you can really further curate who you're targeting with those ads. So remember, not everyone will like your podcast, no matter how great it is. You want to make sure that your ideal client, those people who do want your podcast, are the ones who are going to find it. Next up is to curate your guests for their insight, not their following. This is a big one. I hear this a lot, and I find that a lot of people find it really tempting to go through their list of social media following and look for people who have a really large following. And, that can work if your podcast lines up with their audience. But really, what's important when it comes to podcasting is to partner with guests that really share your values and share your audience, right? So you really want to look for that more really deep, personalized relationship, instead of that really surface level, surefire way to really tank your guest episode because it's not quite targeted to your audience. So just keep that in mind. It's great if your guest has a large following, but you just want to make sure that that large following is your ideal client. And it would really be best if you're always thinking about the value of the content that you're creating and then thoughtfully pitch potential guests on how you'd like to give them a platform to talk about the things that they're passionate about. And make sure that you're really specific in the pitch and do extensive research on your guest before you reach out to them. You really need to be genuinely interested in what they have to bring to the table and not just how many ears they're going to bring to your podcast. And when you approach guests with that forethought and that research and integrity, then you really do improve your chances that they're going to take their time out of their day to record a podcast episode with you. And I'm telling you, that final result will really be quality, valuable content that is going to drive listeners and really spread the word about your podcast. And last but not least is be the guest that you wish you scored. So one of the best ways to promote your podcast is to cross-promote it on someone else's. So you really want to build connections with other mutual podcasters within your niche and trade guest appearances on each other's shows. You both get that moment in front of each other's audiences, and it's really a natural consequence of guesting. You'll promote the other person's to hype up the episode that you're featured on. And guesting on someone else's podcast, is the time to be your most authentic and your integral self, because you really want to show people what they can expect when they migrate over to check out your podcast. So consistency really is key here. You want to make sure that the guest that you have thinks to themselves, oh my gosh, that's so cool. I would be so happy to appear as a guest like they were. So you really want to show up. So here's my challenge for you this week. Take a moment and sit down and jot down your most active social media platform. And if you're not quite certain which one that is, then do a quick little check and really think about which networks your audience is most active on. So say, for example, that's Instagram. You really have a really great conversation going on with your audience there. Start to post about your podcast in a more meaningful way, more than just, hey, I have a new podcast, check it out. Maybe do a video or a reel a few days before talking about how you're so excited. You have a new podcast coming out this week on 5 simple steps for marketing your podcast, and really talk about what the value is there. And if you have something to offer, like for example, for this podcast, I have a free workbook. You could talk about that, and you could say, hey, you can grab my free podcast workbook at jennielyon.com/podcast and, try it out. Then, of course, when the podcast comes out, make sure that you do a post on your networks there, but then also ask some questions. That always will drive engagement and conversation. So with it being about your podcast, maybe you want to do a poll, right? Polls do really well on most social media networks, and you can really start to find out what people are interested in. And it really helps to start to drive those conversations. And then you might want to do a little post podcast marketing, maybe pull out some tidbits from the podcast, some really great sound bites that maybe you could share in stories, and really think about the ways that you can pull this podcast apart and use it in a lot of different ways to get it out there in front of your audience. So that can be, pulling it apart and using it in different ways for social media, sending out a newsletter. The idea is that you don't want to just say, hey, I have a new podcast, check it out. You really want to dig into the value of it and why someone would be interested in it to begin with. All right, so what did we learn today? It's not enough to start a podcast. You really have to let people know about it. So if you're not comfortable talking about your own podcast, get comfortable or hire someone who can help you market your podcast, because it's really not enough to just upload your podcast and forget it. You really have to make sure that people not only know about it, but once they know about it, they remember and they check you out week after week. And you can't control word of mouth, but you can cultivate it by really nurturing those online spaces. So make sure that you are posting about your podcast more than once, but make sure that you're really engaging, ask questions, do polls, add little sound bits. You want to provide people with value. And learn and use Google Ads to target that precise listener demographic. It works. I've used it time and time again to grow listenership on podcasts, and it definitely works. So give it a go. And again, if you're not comfortable with Google Ads, reach out to someone who is, like our marketing team. And when you're seeking out guests with interesting ideas, make sure that it is what you're interested in, are their ideas and what they have to offer your audience. Don't just go off of their follower count. That doesn't always translate into listenership for you. You want to make sure that you're seeking out guests who are interesting and have value to offer and that really want to engage your audience. And it's a win-win when you do it that way. And when you guest on other people's podcasts to grow your reach and your, audience, you can do that mutually. So it's always nice to find someone who has a business that's complementary to you, but not competing, right? So you want to find a guest who has an audience that complements yours. And of course, if you need help, reach out and really consider hiring a digital marketing team like ours or someone in the digital marketing space to really help you maximize your podcast marketing efforts. All right, well, that's what I have for you this week. Again, if you haven't had a chance, jump over to jennielyon.com/podcast to download my free podcast workbook. It walks you through getting started with a podcast and gives you all of the tools that you need to get up and running in no time. And of course, as always, if you have any questions at all, please reach out. I really am happy to jump on a call with you, answer any questions that you have. You can do so at jennielyon.com/chat. And either way, I hope that your podcast is very successful and you get a ton of listeners, and that even one tip off of this podcast is helpful for getting your podcast to the next level. All right, I'll see you next time. See you soon.